I'm Monsignor Hoy, the pastor here at Christ the King. I'd like to welcome you to the 2013 Summer Series, which I think is our 6th one, I think. A couple of different sponsors this year. Father Goldrick is here from St. Patrick's in Falmouth. They're helping to sponsor it. And Father Hessian, he has so much talent. He's pastor of 2 parishes. So Our Lady of the Assumption and Our Lady of Victory are hosting this year. And our first speaker is John Carr, a man I've known for 30 plus years, I guess. I actually once was his boss. And the other night, he and his wife Linda have been on the Cape for a few days, and we had dinner the other night, and he was recalling his job interview with me. Now, I had no recollection whatsoever of what questions I asked, and I wasn't too bad, I guess, from it. John he comes from Minnesota, so if he sounds like Deacon Greg Beckel, you'll know why. But he's been in Washington for a long time, longer than some of the senators and representatives. He did work at the Bishops' Conference, which was, then he headed up a department that was social justice and world peace. It's called something else now. He retired from there about a year ago, spent a semester or 2 at Harvard, and now is starting a new institute on social justice at Georgetown University. So he's got a good background, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about salt, light, and leaven, I guess. John, it's all yours. Wait, John, for those of you who are new here, facilities are out that door to the left, and we will have a brief Q&A after the presentation.
Good. Is this working? Every time you get in a setting like that, I was saying, you can often tell you're at a Catholic, I'm proving my point here. You can tell you're at a Catholic event because usually only the pastor's in the front row, and the audio visuals never work. So we're now steady as she goes. Whenever I use a lavalier mic, I'm reminded of a priest, I think he was Irish, who used a lavalier for the first time, and he was convinced it would not work. And very anxious about this. This was under the old liturgy. And he came out and he said, the Lord be with you. There's something wrong with this microphone. And of course the people responded, and also with you. So now we say, and with your spirit. I mean, that's even tougher. I am really happy to be here. I spend a lot of time on the road, used to. Let me tell you, the summer at the Cape is better than February in Toledo. Just a beautiful place and wonderful hospitality from the team here. And it's really an honor to be with Monsignor Hoy. Of course, I think he has wonderful judgment. He hired me. And to be honest, he does have wonderful judgment. Of all the people I've worked with, and I was at the conference for more than 25 years, the pastor of this parish demonstrated the greatest integrity. Lots of people are smart. He's very smart, as you know. But he demonstrated integrity and fidelity to mission unlike any of the others that I've worked for. They were wonderful people, but you're blessed to have a leader as smart and... One of my favorite things about the job he hired me for is it had the most pompous title in Washington. And Washington's full of pompous titles. How would you like to be Executive Director of Social Development and World Peace for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops? I often tell the story of getting on an elevator at one of these big bishops' meetings. And we have these very large name cards, said my name, my title, the conference. I got on an elevator with a couple, and I could see they were looking at me sort of strangely. And the gentleman finally said to me, "You're not a bishop. And I don't know whether it was my wedding ring or the way I was dressed that gave me away, but I said, no, I'm not a bishop. I work for the bishops. And I could see he was reading the rest of the name card, and he turned to his wife and said, he's in charge of social development and world peace. And she looked at me and said, you need to do a better job. So when it comes to salt, light, and leaven, the Catholic laity in the public square, we need to do a better job. This is a terrific idea to have these series. I actually know Father Sheehan and would love to stay because I'm really getting old and I'm not very spiritual. So I could use his topic, and then the idea of Catholic themes in film sounds a lot better than salt, light, and leaven. But I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to be out of Washington, which is a sad and saddening place these days. But I am an outsider. I mean, I spent a semester at Harvard, so of course I know everything. When I was selected for this semester, and we told our kids that we were going to spend the fall in Cambridge, my son Tim goes, are we talking the real Harvard here? As if, you know, there was a mail order college in Kansas. But even though I've been to Harvard, I don't know what it's like to stand up for human life and dignity, for justice and peace here on the Cape. So my situation reminds me a little bit of a story I tell all the time of a guest preacher at an important parish event. He had prepared well, thought he had delivered the message well, and as was the custom, he and the pastor stood in the back of church after Mass was over and greeted people. And most folks were very kind and complimentary. But one man at the very end of the line came up and held out his hand, and he said, you talk way too fast. You really had very little to say, and it wasn't very helpful. Well, obviously this concerned the preacher. He turns to the pastor and he says, who is this guy? And what is his problem? And the pastor says, don't worry about him. He just goes around repeating what everybody else is saying. So, I am going to talk fast. I hope it might be helpful. I hope I have something worth saying, but I'm not going to stand in the back with Monsignor Hoy, no matter what. What I do bring, even though I'm an outsider, is my work at the conference, which, despite its pressures, was a great place to see the strength and vitality of the Church's social mission, not only in this country, but around the world. In some ways, the most relevant experience I bring is the work in our little parish right outside Washington, where I served on the school board a long time ago. I thought it was about education, it was about fundraising. That was fun. Linda was president of the parish council, which is about as close as you get to purgatory in this life. But I know something about the gap between these grand ecclesial pronouncements and the everyday realities of parish and family life. I'm going to talk about the church's role, the laity's role in public life, so a little truth in advertising. I come from a mixed marriage. Both my parents are Minnesota Catholics, Minnesota, as was said. But my mother is from St. Paul and my dad from Minneapolis, which is a bigger deal than you know. My mother's family absolutely committed Republicans. My uncle was the Republican leader of the Minnesota Senate. My dad and his family a diehard Democrat. My grandfather was Hubert Humphrey's finance chairman when he first ran for mayor of Minneapolis, and there are a few of us still old enough to remember Vice President Humphrey. So I learned at an early age that we can express our values in different ways. In some ways, the most important thing that brings me here is Linda and my efforts to raise kids with Christian values in this culture. I felt at times like we were fighting against a culture that made it difficult to stand up for what we believe. They gave us a real run for our money. They've turned into people again. This weekend we're going to see our second grandchild. This is a much better deal than the first round. At one point in our kids' high school, Kelly, our daughter, was something of a social activist, and Molly was a cheerleader in a dance, I remember the dance team, and I said, I feel like we're living with Sister Helen Prejean and Britney Spears in the same house. Well, they've changed. Sister Helen has a baby, and Brittany is in teaching inner city kids in Baltimore. Here's what I'm going to try and do in the next half hour. What is the mission and message for Catholics in public life? I want to talk about the context, and I would suggest that a big part of the context is our new Holy Father, Pope Francis. So the Francis factor. But what are the assets we bring and what are we up against? And then finally, some directions and some dangers for laymen and women taking our faith into public life. I think we begin with the Word of God. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its flavor, how can it be made salty again? It's good for nothing but to be thrown out. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. They don't put it under a lamp or a bushel basket. I don't know where this. In the same way, let your light shine. How are we in the middle of this place, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, the United States of America, how are we salt, light, and leaven? Well, what brings us together on an evening like this is not politics. It's not ideology. We're not the Democratic Party of Prayer. We are not the Catholic caucus of the Republican Party. We're part of a community of faith, the people of God. And what brings us together are the values of human life and dignity, of justice and peace, of family and community. We've all, I think, worked on a mission statement. I bet you each of these parishes has its own, and that's also a lot of fun. He's worked on one. You fight for every word, and then nobody pays any attention to your wonderful sentences. The best mission statement for Catholics in public life is not on anything I've worked on. It's the familiar scene, those words of Isaiah that Jesus used to describe his mission on earth in his hometown synagogue in Nazareth. I've come to bring good news to the poor, liberty to captives, new sight to the blind, and set the downtrodden free. That was Jesus' mission on earth. That is our task today. How do we bring good news to the poor in a country as divided as we are? How do we bring liberty to captives when we know how people can be enslaved by addiction or disability or discrimination? How do we bring new sight to the blind when we can be blinded by prejudice or ideology or partisanship? And how do we set the downtrodden free when we know there are too many people who live without a sense of hope or freedom? When I say that, I mean, Jesus' mission is our mission. I fear it comes across as one more thing to feel bad about. One more set of expectations we have trouble fulfilling. And I see it very differently. I actually think this is something we weave into everything we do as a community of faith. Everything we do as a parent, as a worker, as a grandparent, as a student, as a citizen. So we want to integrate this commitment to live out Jesus' mission. We don't want to isolate it. It's not something that one committee does for the rest of us. And I would suggest that by taking this mission seriously, it not helps us do more in terms of reaching out to those in need, standing up for unborn children or immigrants. It helps us be more Catholic, be more the people of God, be more the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Now, this is not some new innovation. It doesn't come from Vatican II. Pope Francis talks about this all the time. It's not something he brought with him. This is anchored in the scriptures, in Genesis itself, in the words of the prophets, in Jesus' words and ministry, and in the teaching of the church, what we call Catholic social teaching, which according to our church is real doctrine. and is very much being lifted up by Pope Francis, but it's not his alone. He's building on centuries, millennia of work. There's another way to describe this heritage we have, and it was first described this way by the Apostle John when he wrote the early Christians, and then in the same exact words by Pope Benedict when he wrote us a letter. It's God is love. Deus caritas est. I took 4 years of Latin. That's all I have left. I can figure out. So that means God is love. And what he said is love for the widows and orphans, the prisoners, and the sick and needy of every kind is as essential to the church and to Catholics as the ministry of the sacraments and the preaching of the gospel. The church cannot neglect the service of charity any more than she can neglect the sacraments and the word. So 3 things make us Catholic: proclaiming the word, celebrating the sacraments, and caring for and standing with the poor. And some people say, well, that's just fine, but that doesn't involve politics. That doesn't involve any action in public life. Well, Benedict disagreed. He said charity must animate the entire lives of the lay faithful, and therefore also their political activity, which he called social charity. So this mission of being salt, light, and leaven is not extra credit. It's not optional. It's not fringe. It is at the heart of who we are. And it's not something one piece of the parish or the diocese does for the rest of us. Now the good news is I think this mission, this teaching, is more clear and visible than it's ever been. I think this is at the heart of Pope Francis's leadership. But it's also very much at the heart of Pope Benedict's teaching and Pope John Paul II's witness around the world. The bad news is, for many of us, we don't know this tradition. It's sometimes called our best kept secret. I remember when I worked for Cardinal Hickey in the 80s. We did a lot of work with the poor, particularly sheltering the homeless. And Cardinal Hickey gathered some of the members of our community to support that work. And he made an impassioned appeal. And I thought it was going very well. A guy raised his hand and he said, Your Eminence, this seems like important work to me, but why is it our work? Are these people Catholic? Are they members of our parishes? Do we invite them to pray with us? Why is this the work of the church? And Cardinal Hickey looked at him and said in his own quiet way, he says, we shelter the homeless, not because they are Catholic, but because we are. We care for the sick. We educate the young. We welcome the immigrant because that is a part of who we are. And I think Francis has, in just 100 days, has made that more clear than ever. One thing, I think it's important to remind ourselves how surprising it is that he is our Holy Father. I was invited back to Harvard for one of these panels. I don't think Harvard has a lot of panels on popes. And this pope, they wanted to have a panel on. And everybody was being very wise about this, so it was time for a Latin American, it was time for this. I said, wait a minute. I left here in December. If I had gone to a publisher and said, hey, have I got a novel for you? Chapter 1, the Pope resigns for the first time in 600 years. Chapter 2, we focus on an old Jesuit on a bus in Buenos Aires. Padre. Chapter 3, he gets elected Pope. And his best friend leans over and says, don't forget about the poor. And he says, that's it. I'll call myself Francis. Francis was about the poor, about peace, about creation. I'll be Francis. And then one of the first things he does on Holy Thursday, he doesn't go to some big basilica, he goes to a prison. And he washes the feet of young prisoners, including women and Muslims. What do you think the publisher would say to me if I came in there? He'd say, don't waste your time or mine. It's not going to happen. Well, it did. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see what the rest of the story is. Francis is a man of simple ways and powerful words. And some people say, well, this is just symbols, where he lives and what he wears and how he speaks. And well, in our church, symbols have substance. We're a sacramental church. Signs matter. And there are hundreds of these little stories. My favorite, I was talking the other night. It was the first or second night after the Holy Father had been elected. And he came out of his room, not in the palace, but in the guest house where he lives. And there was a Swiss guard standing at attention. And he goes, this true story is written up. He goes, what are you doing? And he goes, I'm protecting you. He says, well, when did you come? And he said, last evening. He said, you've been standing there all night? He said, yes. And he goes in his room and he pulls out a chair. And he says, sit down. And the Swiss guard says, I can't sit down, I'm on duty. And Francis says, who says you can't sit down? And he says, my commandant. And he says, don't you know? I'm the Pope. I'm telling you to sit down. And he says, have you had anything to eat? And he says, no. He goes back in his room, he makes him a sandwich, and he brings it out, and he says, have something to eat. He says, I can't eat, I'm on duty. And he says, I told you, I'm the Pope. Bon appetit. Well, that's a small thing, but how our Holy Father treats the people around him is a great example for the rest of us. Some of my friends in Washington are very cynical. They say, well, all this is a great PR strategy. His entourage thought of this. When was the last time the Vatican had a great PR strategy? I mean, really. And there is no entourage. This is who he is, and this is why he was elected. This is the story I told, I will be Francis, a man of the poor, of creation and peace. I would like a church which is poor and for the poor. Our focus tonight is on the laity. And I want you to take a look at this slide because it's complicated. The reason I'm using all these slides is because it's more important you see what others have said than what I say. And I'll give this presentation to the parish, and if you want that. This is what Pope Francis says. We tend to clericalize the laity. We focus on the sanctuary rather than bringing the gospel to the world. And some begin to believe that our fundamental ministry is being Eucharistic ministers or lectors. I was proud to be a Eucharistic minister. One time in my life I was a lector. It's an honor, and I would not dismiss that for a second. But he says, our call is to live and spread the faith in our families, workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, and beyond. A layperson is a layperson. He has to live as a layperson. He is to be a leaven of the love of God in society. So he proclaims the faith not from a pulpit, but from everyday life. So in addition to the service we give the church in our special roles, our primary way we live out the faith is in our everyday lives. And the Holy Father has a particular set of expectations. He does not like crabby people. Well, he says, if you don't read these morning homilies, you ought to. He says, we don't need Mr. and Mrs. Weiner. We don't need melancholy Christians whose faces have more in common with pickled peppers than joy. There's no time for the dark joy of gossip. Don't bicker, don't speak ill, don't fight. And he said, don't be involved in careerism. This is one of the things the Holy Father says over and over and over again. He says, a church that does not get out of itself is sick and old. He says, if you're out in the streets, you run the risk of making mistakes. But he says, I prefer a church that's out there making mistakes than one that's turned in on itself. He said this just over the weekend again. My favorite thing, this was in a letter to the bishops he left behind in Argentina. And they have a meeting, and he says, I'm sorry I couldn't be at the meeting. As you may have heard, I have new commitments. And then he writes in the letter, how does that sound? But this point, that the church is not for itself, self-referential is the word he uses. It's out in the world, even though we make mistakes. The other thing, he doesn't like people who come to this with a closed mind, either from the left or the right. There is a temptation, especially in these early months, to say, you know what, we finally have a pope that agrees with me. I always thought growing up the question was whether we agreed with the pope. But he's my kind of pope. He's a social activist, or he's an evangelical Catholic, or he's a culture warrior, or he'll enforce the law. I don't think he's any of those things. I think he is a pastor of a global church. And so let's put our ideologies on the side and try and follow Jesus and his leadership. One of my favorite things is they were chanting in the square, Francis, 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 probably Francisco, Francisco. And he said, not Francis, Jesus. Do me a favor. Don't chant Francis, chant Jesus. So he warns us against the sad life of slumbering Christians, the good enough Catholics. I'm good enough. I go to Mass. I go to confession every once in a while. I use the envelopes. And the one that really hurt me is against couch potato Catholics. Well, what's wrong with that? He doesn't support those who want to turn the clock back, forget about Vatican II. And he says, watch out for the people who want to water down the faith and empty of meaning. He said some people, instead of praying, talk about taking a cosmic bath. I don't know what that is, but it doesn't sound good. And he says we need to be clear who we are as a community of faith. We're the Church of Jesus Christ. We're not a compassionate NGO. So we take up this task to be salt and leaven and light in a church that is challenged. And some of those challenges we know. We're paying, particularly in Massachusetts, sex abuse. How do we pass on the faith? How do we deal with the fact that there are fewer people participating? You're in vibrant parishes. Not all of us are. How do we deal with a society that's lost its sense of morality, where everything is up for grabs? The rise of the nuns, not the sisters, the people who have no faith at all. And now there are threats to our religious identity and freedom. It seems to me that for those of us who are called to live our faith in the world, there are sort of two kinds of approaches. One is if you think we've lost, if you think the culture's against us and overtaking us, then our instincts are to preserve and protect what we have. If you think we're right about life, about family, about justice, about peace, then our task is to engage and persuade, to be in the public arena. Mark Shields, the political commentator, says you can tell an organization that's growing or not by whether they're looking for converts or heretics. We're looking for converts. We want people to join us. The economy I'm going to skip over for reasons of time, but we all know we're not where we want to be. Too many people out of work for too long. Too many people left behind in poverty, even in relatively affluent areas. You look at our economy and you see some people that are pulling ahead, other people that are left behind, a lot of us in the middle, and then some with really no place. Immigrants who are exploited and others. Our nation, I think, is still wounded. I think what happened the day of the marathon is something that none of us have recovered from, especially people here. We feel that sense of vulnerability, that sense of loss. I think people in Washington have some sense of what has gone on here. We're just emerging from 2 long wars. My son-in-law is a returning Iraqi vet who's now working with other Iraqi vets. It's going to be a long, tough process for those guys. How many here remember praying for the conversion of Russia after Mass? You know what? It worked. You know, communism's gone, the wall collapsed, but it's still a very dangerous world. It's particularly a dangerous world to be a Christian. Imagine you were in Baghdad today. Tiny little Christian community under fire. If you were in Bethlehem, surrounded by occupation and militant Islam, one of the holiest places on earth. In Beijing, where if we were having a meeting to talk about how our faith pulls us into public life, somebody would go to jail. I would hope it'd be Monsignor Hoy, not me. This was his idea. You got the wrong guy. Politics should help us do a lot of this, but it is demoralized. Demoralized in the sense they can't seem to get anything done, but also demoralized in the sense they've sort of lost their way, their moral compass. We're supposed to protect the weak, not the powerful. Those are not the priorities of the Senate Finance Committee. I'll skip over some of the whys. What our bishops have said is we need a different kind of politics that focuses more on moral principles than the latest polls, more on the needs of the weak than benefits for the strong, and more on the common good than the demands of the special interests. Jim Wallace, the evangelical preacher and teacher, put it a different way. He said when so many people and so many of our leaders have their finger to the wind, we need to change the wind. We need to change the forces at work in our society. And what do we bring to that? Well, I think we bring some things that are unique to us. We have a set of ideas, a way of thinking about the world as Catholics that is different. We don't reinvent ourselves every 4 years like the politicians. We're not free to forget about unborn children because they're not politically powerful, or immigrants because they don't vote, or poor women on welfare because somebody passed a law, or marriage because it's not trendy anymore. Our church is a lot of things, has been called a lot of things. It has never been called trendy. We stand up for what we believe. And it's a lot more complicated, with all due respect to our evangelical sisters and brothers, than what would Jesus do. The scriptures say without a vision the people perish. Well, we have a powerful vision that has been developed over centuries. I want to reassure you, I am not going to go through all these encyclicals. But this is just the last 100 years. That ought to be next year's Summer Institute. There's another way to describe all those encyclicals.